In the final year of the war in Europe, armies moved at a pace that often outstripped the certainty of their own information. Inside a dim field tent patched with canvas and mud, a lone cartographer worked through the night, revising a worn operational map that had passed through too many hands. A small crease, softened by rain and fingerprints, shifted a penciled line by the width of a fingernail. No one noticed. It was a subtle distortion, barely visible, but enough to push an entire division's position several kilometers off its true mark. At dawn, thousands of soldiers prepared to advance across low, fog-covered hills. They trusted the map completely. Officers reviewed fire plans, artillery crews calibrated their guns, and infantrymen tightened straps and whispered to themselves as the order moved down the line. None of them knew that the coordinates guiding the attack were wrong, or that the enemy had dug in much closer than headquarters believed. The battlefield looked calm, but it was a calm built on a false assumption. When the first barrage erupted, the valley trembled. Men were caught in exposed terrain they believed was safe. Units moved forward, expecting to outflank a weakened enemy, only to walk directly into fortified positions waiting for them with loaded guns. Radio operators shouted warnings that were drowned beneath explosions. Smoke swallowed the sky, and the line between friend and foe collapsed. By the end of that afternoon, more than 7,000 lives were lost, all because of one quiet mistake on a map no one doubted. The error began days earlier, when a battered reconnaissance patrol returned with incomplete reports. Their notes were smudged, some coordinates unreadable, and their radio logs were missing entire minutes of transmissions. Under pressure to complete the updated battlefield chart by morning, headquarters demanded speed over precision. The cartographer spread the torn map across a crate, tracing troop positions while lantern light flickered over its warped surface. He never realized the fold had shifted key markers. The pencil line that should have followed a ridge instead slipped into a shallow gully, nudging the recorded friendly position far from its real location. The correction seemed harmless, almost imperceptible. Exhaustion clouded judgment, and with artillery commanders waiting outside, he inked the final version without a second look. At sunrise, runners delivered dozens of copies to frontline units. Officers unfolded the maps and briefed their men without imagining anything could be wrong. The calm confidence of the morning masked the danger that hid within those lines. The mistake was set in motion, and thousands were now moving according to a battlefield that existed only on paper. The infantry units tasked with the initial advance moved into position under a heavy mist. Their boots sank into soft earth as they spread out across a long ridge, scanning the valley below. According to the map, enemy forces were believed to be withdrawing after a series of defeats. Morale lifted as soldiers whispered that the attack would be quick and decisive. But not far ahead, the real enemy defensive line waited in silence. Dugouts, reinforced with timber, lay hidden beneath camouflaged netting. Machine gun nests were positioned to sweep the valley, and artillery spotters watched the terrain through binoculars, unaware that entire friendly battalions were about to step into their sights. The enemy had not retreated at all. They had strengthened their position. When the order to advance came, whistles cut through the fog, and thousands of men surged forward. The terrain felt strangely exposed, but faith in the map overcame doubt. Only when the first enemy guns opened fire did reality reveal itself. The valley erupted as bullets tore through the mist. Officers tried to redirect their companies, but the trap had already sprung. Far behind the advancing infantry, artillery batteries prepared their opening barrage. Their crews worked with practiced efficiency, loading shells, checking fuses, confirming angles. Every calculation depended on the coordinates printed on the map. When the signal flare rose, the guns thundered, sending a curtain of fire toward what they believed was the enemy line. But the misaligned map placed their intended targets dangerously close to friendly troops. Shells began to crash into fields where entire companies were advancing, scattering men who had no idea the fire came from their own side. The valley filled with shrapnel as soldiers dove into the mud, waving frantically at spotters who could not see them through the smoke. Radio operators attempted to halt the barrage, but conflicting reports and damaged lines caused chaos. The artillery continued firing for minutes that felt like hours. By the time the order to cease finally reached the guns, hundreds of friendly casualties already lay across the churned ground. The mistake was no longer hidden. It was now a catastrophe. Field medics rushed forward with stretchers and morphine syringes, weaving through explosions as they tried to reach the wounded. Many had trained to handle gunshot wounds and shrapnel injuries, but nothing prepared them for the scale unfolding before them. Dozens of men shouted for help at once, their voices drowned beneath incoming fire. The chaos made evacuation nearly impossible. Trucks bogged down in cratered roads, while jeeps attempting to reach the front were forced to turn back under heavy machine gun fire. Medics carried the injured on foot, stumbling through mud while clutching makeshift bandages soaked with blood. They worked until their hands shook and their packs ran empty. As the casualty numbers grew, officers attempted to reorganize what remained of the shattered units. Runners delivered fragmented messages while shells continued falling across the valley. The chain of command frayed under the pressure, and the realization spread that the battle plan had been built on a fatal misunderstanding of the terrain. Reinforcement regiments moving up from the rear expected to join a sweeping offensive. Instead, they marched directly toward the strongest point of the enemy defense. The error in the map had positioned them on a route designed for speed, not safety, guiding them along open ground that provided clear sightlines for hidden enemy gunners. As they advanced, the first incoming salvos landed with terrifying accuracy. Columns scattered as shells burst among them, sending dirt and steel into the air. Platoon leaders yelled for their men to take cover, but there was little shelter available. The smooth fields they had been told were safe became killing zones. Some units attempted to retreat, only to collide with fresh waves of reinforcements pressing forward. Confusion spread rapidly. Without accurate maps or updated intelligence, each regiment believed the others were in the wrong place. The battlefront dissolved into overlapping formations, all exposed to the same well-coordinated enemy fire. Inside the headquarters tent, officers studied the radio reports with disbelief. The map on the table showed units advancing along secure corridors, but the voices on the radio described chaos and heavy losses. Something was clearly wrong. When a forward observer finally transmitted the true position of enemy batteries, the discrepancy became unavoidable. The room fell silent as commanders realized the positions drawn on the map were incorrect. The fold line error had shifted the friendly line several kilometers west, placing nearly every advancing unit at risk. Arguments erupted as officers tried to determine whether the mistake came from reconnaissance, cartography, or miscommunication. But the debate no longer mattered. The damage was already enormous, and the enemy was exploiting every advantage. The only option left was to salvage what remained of the collapsing offensive. Orders went out to pull back, but execution would be slow and deadly. The battlefield had become a maze of broken lines and lost units. Retreating under fire is one of the most difficult maneuvers any army can attempt. Men must move quickly without panicking, maintaining enough order to avoid turning the withdrawal into a rout. On this afternoon, The retreat became a desperate struggle for survival. Officers tried to guide their troops to fallback positions, but the map error meant even the safe zones were uncertain. Machine gun bursts echoed from tree lines as soldiers sprinted through fields already torn apart by artillery. Smoke stung their eyes and reduced visibility to a few feet. Some carried wounded comrades on their backs, refusing to leave them behind. Others crawled, dragging themselves through mud while explosions shook the ground around them. By the time many units reached the ridge they thought would shelter them, enemy shells were already falling there, too. The cartographic mistake had effectively erased the intended defensive positions. With nowhere secure to regroup, exhausted soldiers dug shallow pits and braced for another wave of fire. Throughout the chaos, communication lines deteriorated. Field radios crackled with static, and runners struggled to navigate collapsing corridors of fire. Entire battalions became isolated, unsure of where friendly forces were or which direction led to safety. The battlefield had become a confusing blur of smoke, shattered trees, and muffled explosions. Some groups attempted to break through enemy lines, hoping to reach cover in the forests beyond the valley. Others huddled in shell holes, waiting for a lull that never came. Without coordinated leadership, individual soldiers relied on instinct and the small clusters of men around them. The sense of disorientation became as dangerous as the enemy itself. Meanwhile, enemy artillery spotters took advantage of the confusion. They adjusted their fire with precision, walking shells across the valley in patterns designed to trap survivors. Every movement exposed the retreating soldiers to new threats. The map error had not only misdirected the attack, it had left thousands with no clear path out. As evening approached, the weather shifted. Dark clouds rolled over the valley, and rain began to fall in cold sheets. The downpour soaked uniforms and turned trenches into rivers of mud. Though the rain dampened some fires, it also made evacuation nearly impossible. Slippery slopes caused men to tumble, and wounded soldiers became trapped in rising water. Yet the rain brought a grim advantage: reduced visibility. Under cover of the storm, small groups of survivors slipped through gaps in the enemy barrage. Medics used the darkness to move injured men to makeshift aid stations hidden beneath collapsed barn roofs and shattered wagons. The retreat slowed, but it continued. Commanders worked frantically to redraw the battlefield using updated reports, marking new fallback lines, and directing engineers to prepare emergency defensive positions. But with every hour, the toll grew higher. What had begun as a coordinated advance had collapsed into a struggle simply to keep units alive long enough to regroup. By nightfall, the valley had become eerily quiet. Smoke hung low over the ground, drifting between the silhouettes of destroyed vehicles and broken artillery pieces. Lanterns flickered as medics searched for survivors, calling out softly into the dark. Many wounded men responded weakly, their voices nearly lost beneath the distant rumble of enemy guns. Engineers arrived to clear paths for evacuation, marking routes with small lamps and whispered instructions. They worked with urgency, knowing the enemy could launch a night assault at any moment. The broken map was now useless. Every direction had to be judged by instinct or reconnaissance. The soldiers who had survived the day moved cautiously, stepping around craters and bodies. Behind the lines, chaplains walked among the wounded, offering words of comfort. Some soldiers stared silently into the dark, unable to process the devastation. Others clutched their rifles tightly, as if afraid the ground beneath them might vanish. The scale of the losses was only beginning to reveal itself. Hours later, the first accurate head counts began to arrive at headquarters. Entire companies were missing. Some battalions had been reduced to a fraction of their strength. The staggering number of casualties left officers speechless. Reports confirmed the truth. More than 7,000 soldiers were dead, wounded, or unaccounted for. The cartographer who had drawn the faulty line sat alone in the dim tent, staring at the map that had guided the entire operation. He traced the crease with shaking hands, realizing where the mistake had been made. The weight of the error crushed him. It was not malice or carelessness, only exhaustion and a moment's inattention. But the consequences were irreversible. Commanders faced the brutal reality that the offensive had failed because of information they believed was correct. The enemy, unaware of the map error, had simply taken advantage of their own strong defensive ground. The tragedy was not the result of betrayal or sabotage. It was the result of a fragile detail that everyone trusted without question. As dawn broke the next day, surviving units gathered behind hastily built barricades. Smoke drifted across the valley, masking the full extent of the destruction. Officers reassured their men that reinforcements were coming and that the line would hold. But the mood was heavy, weighed down by the memory of the previous afternoon. Engineers collected what equipment they could salvage, marking the locations of destroyed vehicles and abandoned guns. Medics continued to search for wounded men, some of whom had survived the night by sheltering beneath debris or lying motionless in shallow craters. Every rescue felt like a small victory amid overwhelming loss. When the sun finally rose high enough to illuminate the valley, the truth became painfully clear. The battlefield had been shaped not by strategy, but by a single misdrawn line. The soldiers who had fought and died the previous day had done so believing they were following accurate orders. The map error had altered their fate in a way no one could have foreseen.